At each summer service, at this point in our service, we take a break from the weekly Torah portion to give sermons or Devar Torahs on a special theme. And each week of this summer, we are spotlighting a different prophet. Tonight, I'd like to invite us to spend a little time on a figure who I would describe as a maybe prophet or a perhaps prophet. Jewish texts don't agree on if she's a prophet or not. You have likely all heard of her, but you may or may not have thought of her as one of the prophets, and for good reason. So before I dramatically or not so dramatically introduce her, I'd love to crowdsource, as we reach the end of the summer, we have in the room some amount of prophecy expertise. I know that many folks like me may have been traveling a fair amount this summer, but some people in this room have hit many of these summer sermons. So I'd love to crowdsource for just a moment. What are, as you see it, some of the main characteristics of a prophet in Judaism? Like, what makes somebody a prophet? Yes, Jacob.
Being able to communicate with God.
Okay, this is really key, being able to communicate with God, and that it goes both ways often, right? That like they can talk to God and then tell people what God thinks, and then they can also report back to God and say, hey, this is what the people think. Thank you so much. Any other characteristics of a prophet? Yes, Ellie. That's super crucial. Thank you. Guiding the Jewish people in their time of need. So many of the prophets lived through these very hard times. And what does it look like to look to them for guidance? Any other prophecy characteristics? Please go ahead. Justice, absolutely. Many of the prophets are huge, outspoken people standing up for justice. Thank you so much. Okay, this is a fabulous list. Please. Absolutely. Prophets are very direct, and many of them, there's lots of impending doom. I think that's a really good summary. I think this is a pretty good list. So with keeping that list in mind, I'd like to ask one more question. How do we know that someone is an official prophet? So like if I were to sort of start speaking about impending doom and say that, Judaism said X, Y, Z, according to our religion, I would not be a prophet. So sort of one more trivia question. How do we distinguish a figure as a prophet in Jewish tradition? What do they need to be? Wait, it says so. What says so, Joel? Okay, yeah. So actually, this is the heart of it. There are two different places where it could say so, and this is where we'll get to our mysterious maybe prophet in a moment. So one is in the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible itself. So there are a lot of people who are either literally described as a prophet, so Navi or Neviah, like that's the name, the title given to them, or we watch them doing what we heard earlier. We watch them talking to God and then telling people what God said and sort of communicating. However, there's also a list in the Talmud of 55 prophets, and what's really interesting about them is that some of them fit into this sort of set of characteristics we've just identified, and some of them fit into it a little less well, or in a little bit more of a complicated way. And so one such figure who the Talmud names as a prophet, who it's debated in Jewish tradition, even though the Talmud says it, is Esther, Queen Esther from Purim, who takes great risks to save the Jewish people of her kingdom from annihilation and ultimately succeeds. So this is a trivia question with sort of just one right answer, but maybe there's extra. Why is Queen Esther a complicated entry in the category of prophet? Why does she not quite hit all of our things? Go ahead. Exactly. Thank you so much. We didn't even have to go to like a sort of right trivia answer. That's the correct one. Queen Esther is never described in the Book of Esther in writings, Ketuvim, as communicating with God. And that's because the Book of Esther in general doesn't mention the word God once. On its surface, it's a story all about human beings. And in some ways, it's especially about what people do when they don't have a clear way to access the right answer to their problems, whether by talking to God or otherwise. In one of the most important scenes of the Book of Esther, Mordecai asks Esther to go to the king and advocate with him for saving the Jewish people, and Esther is afraid that doing so will endanger her life. And Mordecai replies in part that ulai, maybe, it was for this moment or a moment like this that Esther became queen. So he's saying that he doesn't know, and she's also saying she doesn't know. And they're leaning in some ways in this story very much to that they don't really know, but that they're going to do their best. And in many ways, for many of us, it's a very relatable story, those parts, because we live in a world like that too often, where we don't really know what's next, and we sort of have to lean into maybe. But the Talmud names Esther as a prophet. Even if we read the text literally, the absence of God, and also the absence of referring to her as a prophet, as a neviah, in the text itself, but most of all, the absence of sort of on-screen moments where she talks to God would seem like they disqualify her. However, there are sort of two ways we could get around with this. One is if we assumed that Esther was having more direct conversations with God sort of outside of the moments in the book itself. And the other is, unless you think that the Book of Esther might actually still be about God in some way, but use coded language and metaphors. So the Septuagint takes the first approach. It doesn't imagine Esther as a prophet necessarily, but the Septuagint imagines Mordecai having dreams that come from God, foretelling everything that is to come. So the Septuagint also mentions the name of God 50 times. So it's sort of a heavily edited story of Esther, but with lots of God in it. The Talmud doesn't take that approach. It doesn't refer to the Septuagint. Instead, it imagines that maybe God is in the Book of Esther, but in a more coded or metaphorical way. And so one of the literary arguments in Tractate Megillah of the Babylonian Talmud is that maybe every time the Book of Esther mentions King Ahasuerus by name, it's definitely talking about the person, King Ahasuerus. But maybe whenever the Megillah, the Book of Esther, says something about the king or mentions royalty in a way that is not attached to a person in a clear way, maybe in those moments, the Talmud posits, the Megillah is actually talking in a more covert way about God. This leads to a lot of fascinating theological arguments. For example, in chapter 6 of the Book of Esther, the chapter begins with the words, "That night the king stopped sleeping." And Tractate Megillah of the Talmud argues that maybe this could mean that in the early parts of the story where terrible things are befalling the Jewish people, that God was asleep, that God wasn't paying attention. And that late in the story, when people advocated for themselves more, God woke up and suddenly started tuning in. It's in some ways a more radical theological argument than we'd often think about assigning to late antiquity, but very much part of what the Talmud contains within it. So here's the question, what does this all have to do with Esther? The Talmud's argument boils down to chapter 5. So right before the king or God wakes up in chapter 6, and right after Mordecai has appealed to Esther that maybe she's the person to do this in chapter 4. And in chapter 5, Esther takes a huge risk and decides to approach the king. And as she's getting ready, verse 1 of chapter 5 tells us, Vatilbash Esther Malchut, which is often translated as, and Esther dressed herself in royal garments or royal clothing. But it actually doesn't have the word garments or clothing in it. So a more literal translation would be something like, and Esther dressed herself in royalty, or Esther dressed herself royally, perhaps. The Talmud kind of goes to town with that one word malchut, royalty, and it says that it's a coded reference to God. Specifically, it says that if the verse had really been talking about what Esther wore, it would have used the phrase bigdei malchut, royal clothing. But instead, it says she clothed herself in royalty, which the Talmud argues using another moment in the Bible in Chronicles, which for the Talmud is sort of a weak argument because it's a very late book, but using another moment in the Bible when a person clothes themselves in God's spirit, more metaphorically. And therefore, Megillah 14a says this means that in this moment in the Book of Esther, she was really wrapping herself in Ruach HaKodesh, the spirit or inspiration of the divine. This kind of literary argument is fairly common in the Talmud, and it's also fairly unpersuasive to many modern readers. So if it's not that persuasive to you, that's totally fine. And I wanted to invite us to get not too stuck on that reasoning about why Esther was a prophet, and instead look at the big meta argument that the Talmud is making here, which is maybe that something like that at one of these big turning points in the Book of Esther, at this point, when Esther stops being a person who things happen to against her will and starts being a person who decides to do something, in this case, something really risky that she might be kind of afraid to do, but she's doing it for the sake of what she thinks is the right thing. It's at this precise moment the Talmud is arguing that Esther reaches out to God, and perhaps that God is with her in some way as she does this really hard but really right thing. What I find very touching about this is that often when we do hard things that we believe are right, but that we find frightening or uncertain, we can sometimes feel very alone. Sometimes we actually are alone, or we're at least not with other people. Imagining Esther as a prophet, not just a person who put on a fancy outfit before doing a hard thing, not just a person who put on queenly clothing, but a person who took a deep breath and connected with the divine or that which was beyond herself. Imagining Esther as a prophet might serve as a kind of prompt for us, both that God or something beyond ourselves can be with us in hard moments, and also whether or not you believe in God or believe in a kind of God who hears and answers prayers or might come spend time with us in a more literal way. Also that none of us are alone, as we might sometimes feel we are. We're all connected to a rich history, and we walk in the footsteps of people who have done hard things before us. We are connected to a deep sense of right and wrong, as Esther was, and we're also connected to each other, as Esther was as well. Right before, Esther dresses herself in malchut, in royal clothing, or in a connection to the divine. She asks Mordecai to assemble the Jews of Shushan and have them fast for 3 days. And she says that she's going to fast too. In other words, she's saying that she will be together with them in spirit, even though they might not be in the same place and they might not be doing the same thing. If and when we find ourselves called to do things that we believe in, but that also frighten us, I hope that maybe, if it's helpful, we can think about following in the footsteps of Esther, the maybe prophet, and remember that we are not alone either.